Hello, my name is Hugh Patterson, and I'm presenting today at the Dublin Core 2022 conference. And I'm presenting a paper titled An OLAC Perspective on Services, Forgotten Language Resources. Services, I say, are forgotten in this case because, well, in the OLAC OAI aggregator, there's no records for services. Further, in the Dublin Core literature, there's not a whole lot of examples for services description using the DCMIType services. So today I explore those issues. By way of refresher, Dublin Core and the DCMIType service, where do they fit? So Dublin Core has several constituent components, the Dublin Core elements, the Dublin Core terms, the DCMIType vocabulary, which is the part of the Dublin Core Metadata Standard that I'm going to be basing my conversation out of. Then there's the 8 external vocabularies that Dublin Core can link to and use. And then there's the 12 different syntaxes that are defined for very specific fields within the Dublin Core element or terms. So Dublin Core DCMIType vocabulary has several options, services where I'll be talking about, but then I'll contrast those with interactive resources and software a little bit during my talk. Of course, there are collections, data sets, events, and etc. through the other parts of the DCMIType vocabulary. Now, I talk about OLAC in the title, but what is OLAC? Well, OLAC is a consortium or a group, I'd say a little bit less than a consortium, but data providers that work with language archives, or they steward language resources. They have awareness of language resources, and they provide data via the Dublin Core Metadata Standard, the OLAC vocabularies that modify the Dublin Core Metadata Standard, and they do that via OAI syntax. So the Dublin vocabularies, there's 5 that modify various elements. So 2 that modify the type element, 2 that modify the subject element, and one of those can also be used to modify the language element. And then the role that also does the Dublin Core, modifies the Dublin Core contributor element. So how do they do that? Well, syntactically, they do that through the XSI type declaration, because it's an XML based on OAI. It's an XML syntax. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts, the technical side of it. But let's look more broadly at the context a little bit. So language resource indexing. So talking about discoverability and thinking about discoverability when community members of minority languages want to discover where resources are stewarded about their language, where can they go? Also, when scholars want to know more about their particular research language, where can they go? So there are some commercial options that answer these questions. There's the linguistic and language behavior abstracts. There's the linguistics bibliography, linguistic abstracts online. All of these resources have several 100,000 individual resources indexed by language. In contrast to those commercial options, there's a scholar-driven community called the Glottolog with just under 500,000 entries. And in contrast to those resources, which are predominantly print media and also predominantly scholarly publications, there are 3 networks of archives and stewards of language resources that are stewarding multimedia resources. And so there's OLAC, there's Clarin, and there's Metashare. And there's some overlap, but in general, they're independent networks of archives. So Clarin and Metashare both have their own independent schemas. Some elements of those schemas are describable or equivalent to Dublin Core metadata elements. So there's some crosswalk availability, some congruency. In contrast to those 2 independent schemas, which sometimes don't have a one-to-one correspondence with things in Dublin Core, there is OLAC, and it builds specifically on Dublin Core. And so the OLAC community is the basis of my discussion today. Talking about DCMIType service, well, the two examples I found in the literature that talk about use cases where DCMIType service was used, one was in relationship to the New Zealand government, and the other was in relationship to scholarly resource discovery service that was developed in the UK. And they were advertising other servers where resources could be queried from using SOAP or web services. Broadly, though, speaking about service, I think we should kind of give it some definition, or kind of give it some bearing in the conversation. And the idea in general in services is that there's a client or customer that has something to offer to the service does something with that, and then the client or customer receives something back from the service, whether that's the same client as the giving client or a different client. Those are some open-ended questions. But if we're to look at service more holistically than just the very simple view of it, we might have to answer some questions like, what is the content type that's going in, or what is the content type coming out of that service? Is there a data retention policy? And is the service manager the same as the service owner? And in cases where language resources are involved, I see a clear distinction between the service itself and the service model. So if we take Google Translate, for instance, it's driven, the power of its transformations on the data is driven by a neural network AI. And in that case, the user interface where people would go to submit data and receive a response is independently managed from the computational side of things. So rather than talking about service model in terms of the business model, I'm talking about it in terms of the operational technical models that drive that. And I'm suggesting that those technical models could be independently described resources. And in Dublin Core, we would relate those with a relation element. In the literature, there's also something about libraries having a variety of services, and some of the more technical services are harvesting, metadata generation, metadata augmentation, transformation, equivalence, crosswalking, archive persistence of data, and annotation, metadata improvement and ratings, aggregation. Now, these are covered in some detail in Phelps' 2006 paper. And it's, I think, very useful to think about these, because if we were to advertise these services, those would be a large variety of service records that could be available in the Dublin Core metadata schema if libraries were to advertise those. For instance, if we were to develop an aggregator of library services, right? Where can you find something and you wanted to know which institutional library had a service like that? Now, I think it's important to say that some things are not a service. I'm going to give a couple examples from linguistics here. And I would suggest that these are interactive resources. They're based off of persisted data or hosted data in some cases. But this is Pangloss, and when a visitor goes here, they can listen to a audio and they can see the written transcription at the same time. And they have independent resource identifiers. And this is a very similar vein, but this one also works with video and has grammatical descriptions as well. This is a third case. And in this case, the screen components can be adjusted. So the font size can be adjusted, the text display size can be, and the speed of playback can be adjusted. So there's some interactivity here. So when we look at service description, I think we can use some of the Dublin Core elements and the Dublin Core terms to describe a service quite fully. But I want to say that we should think about service in contrast to other things that are possible in the DCMI types vocabulary, and to qualify as a service, it should do at least two things. First, it receives data input and computes on the data, and then outputs some or all of that data into some new structure format. So essentially, what's happening is the service is changing. To qualify as a service, it has to change the expression or the manifestation of the input. Second, it has to meet both definitions, right? The second is it allows for multiple inputs to the defined workflow. In contrast to the presented criteria for services, interaction resources or interactive resources act on a single set of input data and provide some sort of enhanced understanding on the basis that is of a single input. So interactive resource, I can call it an app, I can call it a web page, do lots of different things, but it's got one essence, one manifestation that is mutable in some way. It's good for one set of data, whereas a service, you can do this over and over and over again with different sets of data or different inputs. So I think a good service record might have some things like a URL address, a description for the content in and out, and returned content to the same client or different client, data retention policy, a privacy policy, modality of materials that are acted upon. We can use a lot of mark descriptors for in the contributor roles, like the service manager, service owner, but for language resources, two of the important things that we need to know are the language of the user interface and the language of data processing. And so there's only one language element. So this is where OLAC and the Open Language Archives community, if we're going to index services, would really benefit from adding some additional clarification. Overlap of services and language resources. This is a Euler diagram, and if we had all language resources that we knew about in the gray, I'm suggesting that the purple would be a class of all possible services and that there's some overlap. And if we knew of all, yellow being all of the index language resources, well, it would have some overlap with the purple. And if all the ones that are available in the green, only about 65% of the ones in OLAC are really have an identifiable language associated with them. This is related to practices of indexing and curation at the data providers. Some example of services that I've seen in as a linguist and as a scholar, Reflex allows people to compare dictionaries for historical linguistic analysis, allows the person to engage with the data in a variety of ways and create hypotheses and document those hypotheses and then export the data. ASR is a automatic speech recognition, speech to text would fall into that category, and then Google Translate, which I talked about earlier. Now, I think an important part in the written paper that accompanies this presentation, I talk about this a little bit more detailed, but approaching the modality of the service is important. So by modality, are we talking about a service that acts on artifacts that are audio in nature, or are textual in nature, or are video in nature even? So a script is another important point. BCP 47 allows us to sometimes specify the script. So ENGB would be British spelling of English versus the US spelling of English. And it could operate at the level of the glyphs used in the case of Chinese and used in China and Chinese used in Taiwan. But it gets harder to identify if the service is a speech-to-text service or a text-to-text translation service. So I appreciate you listening to this talk, and I anticipate your questions. And of course, you can contact me even outside of the conference. Thank you very much.